Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of the SAFT podcast. Yes, it is episode 64 now. We're a good way along
Yep.
from our first episode. I don't know why I keep on stressing on that, but I'm always excited to see yet another number added to our episode list. So last week, what were we talking about? Our last episode, what were we talking about?
Yeah. In the last episode, we were talking about a brief overview of what our experience was with the conference, and then we touched up into our head dive into arguments for God's existence, and we were touching up about the Kalam Cosmological Argument, right? And we were stating what that looks like. So it's a very simple argument to follow. It's a very simple argument to memorize.
Right.
It has three sentences in it, basically. The first is everything that begins to exist has a cause. The next is the universe began to exist.
Right.
And the conclusion is therefore the universe has a cause.
Right.
Very simple stuff.
Very, very simple.
And so we also broke down about how we say that such an argument, what is the type of this argument, like a deductive argument, what makes this argument valid. If you were to rebut it, what are the ways you can rebut it, and along that lines. So it is a very brief introduction, but I'm really looking forward to diving into the Kalam and what all surrounds it as we get deeper into this conversation.
Yeah, so touching up on it, let me just try to summarize it, guys. One thing is I'm terrible at remembering things, so let me try to get the three statements or three sentences.
Let's see how you do. Let's see how you do.
Okay. So one is the universe has a cause.
That is the conclusion.
That is so the universe began to exist.
No, everything that begins to exist has a cause.
Okay, everything. Oh no, the first thing that you. Okay, so the first one is everything
that begins to exist.
Okay, so everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, hence the universe has a cause. Perfect. Yeah, it's actually very simple when you say it yourself.
Yeah.
Right. So essentially, we had also talked about what a deductive argument means in the last episode. So essentially, what it is the arguments that you are making for the ending conclusion should be very airtight. So all that they can argue for is to essentially they have to disprove what the first two premises or the statements are,
or show that the logic is invalid. Like I said, you remember the Caesar example.
Right.
The statements may be true, but if you use the word Caesar in two different senses in those sentences, then the logic is invalid.
Right.
So one doesn't follow the other. You can't make a jump from the first to the second sentence. So if the premises, that is statement 1 and 2, if those premises are true and the logic connecting them is valid, then de facto a deductive argument is airtight. There is no way around it.
Right.
So down the line, we will look at arguing for the resurrection, and there we'll be looking at the argument, the inference to the best explanation. Okay, an inductive argument.
Okay.
There it isn't airtight. You are inferring to the best explanation, not the explanation. You're seeing what best fits the data. So there is much more leeway for people to play around and bring out objections. But with a deductive argument, if you have to attack it, these are the sources. The truth of the premise or the logic there. You have to attack it only at these 2 points.
Right.
So it sort of helps us in trying to figure out whether the argument is valid or not, because you know where to check to see if it's good or not.
Exactly. Inductive is like a lot more.
It's a lot more open.
Right. Okay. And okay, so the Kalam Cosmological Argument. That's a mouthful.
It's a mouthful, yeah.
Yeah, like
Which is why we always say KCA. We just we can't type
just
Kalam.
keep saying Kalam Cosmological Argument. It's a tongue twister when you say it fast. You can't say it 3 times. I don't think anyone can say it 3 times without twisting their words.
If you did, drop it in the comments whether you did. And we decided to blindly believe you.
Yeah. So So why cosmological in the name?
So it has to do with the word cosmos, which means the universe. So the Kalam Cosmological Argument, like you said, the conclusion is therefore the universe has a cause. So the argument centers around the universe itself, which is why you have the word cosmological in it. And the interesting thing is, now there are other arguments that also has cosmological, and we'll touch on that later. But if you look at the fine-tuning argument, I was just thinking about this, the fine-tuning argument has to do with the universe. So you're talking about how there are these constants, like the gravitational constant, it's a particular figure. And there are these equations out there. So these are these abstract values and constants. And the fine-tuning argument shows us that if you were to play around with these numbers by the slightest unimaginable fraction, something like 1 part in 10 to the power 120.
Right.
Yeah, it's a very small fraction. And like you said, if you play around with it, the universe wouldn't exist and those sort of drastic effects follow. But that is not called the fine-tuning cosmological argument. It's just called the fine-tuning argument.
fine-tuning.
It's a fine-tuning argument. So the name is just because of the fact it falls into a group of argument type. That's basically it. So that's why it's called the Kalam Cosmological Argument, because it falls into this group of cosmological argument.
Right. Where do you think this cosmos came from? Like, I know there's astronauts and cosmonauts, as they call it in Russia or something. But where did cosmos come from?
I think it has, I'm just saying, just eyeballing it here sort of. I think it comes from Greek language, the cosmos,
Maybe.
because I remember seeing the word cosmos written with a K. That's a
Right.
Greek way of writing it. So could be it.
Yeah.
If you know, let us know in the comments.
Okay. So that's good to know. Is this argument the only cosmological argument that we have right now?
No. So that's what I said. The Kalam cosmological argument. I keep on.
You know what? Let's just call it KCA.
Okay. The KCA, but there is a oomph to it when you say the Kalam.
Yeah, the
cosmological-
Kalam, and also it has a lot of relevance to us Indians,
Yes,
right? The
the
Kalam
Kalam.
cosmological argument. The first person that you think of is APJ Abdul Kalam.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And,
And I cannot tell you what APJ stands for.
Well, I've looked it up in preparation for the podcast.
Oh, very nice.
So APJ Abdul Kalam, the full form is Abul Pakir Jainul Abdin Abdul Kalam.
Goodness, a mouthful.
I think that is a word
That's very strong.
yeah, that's a name that rightly fits the rocket man of India, the people's president.
Yeah.
So
For those who don't know who APJ Abdul Kalam is.
yeah, we know that we have a lot of audience joining us from the US. It's the most listened to base. So the late Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam was a rocket scientist. He was a phenomenal man. He's called the rocket man of India because he helped us enter that rocket age, enter the space age with all of his leadership at ISRO, Indian Space Research Organization. I really hope I didn't butcher that. And then he was presented with the opportunity to be the president of India, the nominal head of the state. And he is lovingly referred to as the people's president. The only president to be referred to as the people's president. So he has a special place in all of our heart, especially for people who are into science as well because of his inspiring role. The other day, one of our church members was mentioning to me that when he went and did an apologetic session at a place, they were talking about the Kalam Cosmological Argument. At the end, sort of like summary, they're asking people, okay, what do you recollect from the whole session? And the person said, Dr. Kalam argument.
That was coming.
So, like you said, when we hear Kalam, it instantly
APJ
goes to
Abdul Kalam.
Dr. Kalam. Anyway, coming back to the family of cosmological arguments. So there are 3 arguments that come under this broad category. So you have Thomas Aquinas, who presented his cosmological argument. Then you have Leibniz, who presented his Leibnizian cosmological argument. And then the one we know, Kalam cosmological argument. So let me just quickly break down what Aquinas and Leibniz argument is. Well, these arguments have a lot of emphasis on the philosophical part.
Right.
So with the Kalam, when you look at how the argument is built up and the data and evidence that is gathered to present that the conclusion is valid, you will see philosophical arguments brought in. And because you're talking that the universe began to exist, we have a lot of scientific points that can be brought in to show that the universe began to exist. But these other 2 arguments, they focus more on the philosophical side. Not so much. There may be scientific implications, but they don't specifically bring out scientific evidence or as such.
Right.
And Thomas Aquinas' argument is quite old. So the Aquinas version had to do with the fact that you cannot have an infinite regress, which is basically that you can't go backwards. You can't regress infinitely. You can't have infinite regress. You can't keep going back and back and back all the way into past eternal.
Right. And does that connect to who created God as well? Because that also ends up being an infinite regress.
Yeah. So that is where he comes up with his point. So his essential part has to do with that you cannot regress infinitely back.
Right.
Because you need to have a starting point to be at the present. We will look at that in depth in the Kalam. And so he presents 3 ways to point towards what he called the uncaused cause. So this is something that is bringing things into existence like a cause, but this is uncaused. Right. And the 3 ways he did was pointing towards an unmoved mover. So he was looking at the things like, there are things in motion. Okay, things are in motion, they are moving. So you need to have something that is unmoved, not in motion, but can move other things. Because else, if this is moved by this, and this is moved by this, and this is moved by this, and this is moved by this, you keep on going on infinite regress.
Right.
So you need to have, because the essential point was that you can't have infinite regress. So he pointed to the fact that therefore you must have an unmoved mover,
Right.
something that sets things in motion,
Okay.
but is not subject to motion itself. Because then what moved that thing?
Right.
Right? And so this is a very rudimentary way of, he was looking at things in motion in the universe. That was his starting point. So he said, okay, so there must be an unmoved mover. Then the other thing he said was, again, the point of this causing that to exist, and something else causing this to exist. So you can't have that also going backwards infinitely. So you must have a first cause, something
Right.
that doesn't have a cause, but is causing everything else to exist. The same unmoved mover principle.
Right.
Not moved, but moving everything else. And the third way he pointed towards it was with called an absolutely necessary being. And let me just, this is why I said it's very, very philosophical. So there are two types of beings that we can identify as, categorize as. So you have necessary beings and contingent beings.
Okay.
Contingent are things that could have not existed. I am contingent. You are contingent. The table, everything that you see in this room is contingent. Their existence is dependent on something else. So us parents, our parents depend on their parents, so on and so forth.
Depend on their parents, as in like they depended on them to be existing.
Yes. So it is not that I must necessarily exist.
Yeah.
If other factors were not in place, then I wouldn't exist.
Yeah, right.
In that sense. So my existence is contingent
On
or
my parents.
dependent on other things existing.
Right.
So I'm a contingent being. So what Thomas Aquinas, again applying the same principle of infinite regress, saying that you can't go back this chain infinitely, said that you must therefore have something that is absolutely necessary, meaning a being that is not dependent on anything else for its existence. So an unmoved mover that is moving things, an uncaused cause that is causing other things to exist, and an independent, necessary being that can cause other things or can be the source for other things to depend upon. Okay, so these are three ways where he used to point towards the idea of, pointing towards his cosmological argument, so eventually pointing towards the uncaused cause. So unmoved mover, first cause, absolutely necessary being, all coming towards the uncaused cause. So this was Thomas Aquinas' cosmological argument. Now comes Leibniz, and his is similar to Aquinas, but his was on a different route. Leibniz came up and asked this question: why are we here? It's a question that we sometimes ask ourselves. Right? You're sitting in your workplace and you're like, why am I here? My friends have asked me this in college. Dude, what am I doing in this university?
And then imagine you'll just like go on a
Let
whole...
me tell you about Leibniz.
Why am I here? Completely rhetorical, but you just insert yourself in that.
So Leibniz came up and asked, why is this universe existing? So it must have an explanation for its existence. And then he pointed out the fact that there are things that exist whose explanation is found elsewhere, right? Their explanation is found as to why they exist. And then he went along that same line and said, so eventually there must be something that is self-explanatory.
Okay.
It doesn't need an explanation beyond itself.
Okay.
Everything else will look for its explanation beyond itself. But there must be this something that does not have an explanation beyond itself. It's self-explanatory. And so if you take something like the statement like, the universe is past eternal. The universe never had a beginning.
Okay.
Its past is eternal. Even if you say that, the question still remains, but why does the universe exist? What is the explanation for the existence of the universe?
Right.
So Leibniz took that different route. So that's why they look confusing. And I was also confused initially at the beginning with the fact of one thing depending on something else. Right. Thomas Aquinas said it is dependent on something else for its very own existence.
Right. It seems like it might have some holes. Like, because of how confusing it is, you might feel like...
Yeah, I mean, maybe it has to do with the way I'm simplifying and presenting it. Because once you get into the specifics of the Leibnizian cosmological argument, you touch upon things like principle of sufficient reason.
Okay.
I remember reading principle of sufficient reason, the entire chapter, and then having to start again because I had no clue what I read. Because it is so complex to work out. But the fact that atheist philosophers are still grappling at it shows that it has some merit to it. Okay. Else, like Jesus mythicism, it would be shoved to the side and no one is going to bother about it. So Thomas Aquinas went along the line saying, the similarity part is here that Thomas Aquinas said, this thing is dependent on its existence for something else, And you must have something that is independently existing, necessarily existing. It cannot depend on anything else. Leibniz came and said, this thing is looking for something else for its explanation. Not necessarily its existence as it itself, but its explanation is found elsewhere. So again, looking beyond the being itself, but in the form of what is the explanation, not what is the source of its existence. And so that's what I said. The reason we are not looking at these arguments, the Leibnizian and Aquinas argument, is that they are quite complex for us to break down in a sensible way without opening up holes in the argument. Like the thing is, when you simplify the language, it leads to ambiguity as to what exactly you meant,
Right.
and that opens up a lot of holes.
Yeah.
And we will, I think we may get to it in the next episode when we look at the term nothing, right? You have to be very specific in how you define it. Else it just opens up a whole lot of misinterpretation and confusion, all that stuff. So these are the other two cosmological arguments. But again, I hope I just quickly clarified the confusing part.
Yeah. So, so we hear the name like Kalam Cosmological Argument. Was there a Kalam that came up with the cosmological argument, or what was that?
So, if you look at the roots of the KCA, it was originally brought up by Christian thinkers to refute Aristotle's eternal universe. So, he presented the universe is eternal, and they came and refuted. So, that is where you can find sort of like the very rudimentary form of it. Then Al-Ghazali, a medieval Islamic theologian, he came up with the very first formulation of it. And it's a mouthful, but I'll just let you in on it. He said, every being which begins has a cause for its beginning. Now, the world is a being which begins. Therefore, it possesses a cause for its beginning.
Oh, okay. So that's exactly...
It's exactly the thing, but it's much more wordy.
Yeah.
So this is where you find, like in this form, this structured form, the presentation of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. And then Al-Ghazali worked on other ways to point towards the fact that, the universe is a being, or the universe has had a beginning and all of that. We'll look at that later. And then at University of Edinburgh, a young guy who finished his master's in philosophy goes there to do a PhD under, let me get the name, John Locke, who was one of the leading philosophers at that time. His name was William Lane Craig. He was this thin guy, just walked up there, and he did his PhD. And his work was on the Kalam Cosmological Argument.
Yeah.
So a book came out of it. I think you can see it here. I think this is the book. Yes, that is the book. The Kalam Cosmological. That is his PhD work. And it is where he presented with the formulation that we are familiar with the formulation that you by had at the beginning.
Yeah.
That was Dr. Craig's presentation of it, because Al-Ghazali's was a mouthful.
Right.
And then Dr. Craig, he looked at the presentation. So Al-Ghazali had brought in some arguments from the astronomical observations that they had at that time with regards to the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn, to point towards that the universe must have had a beginning.
Right. So it's essentially what we are doing is we're trying to prove the first two premises to be undeniably true.
Yeah.
So that we can satisfy the conclusion that we are reaching.
So showing that these premises are more plausibly true than they are false.
Right. And by plausible, it essentially
More
means
reasonable.
that's reasonable to
Reasonably
understand.
true,
What's the difference between probable and plausible?
Probably, I would say probably something that you can quantify in some sense. Plausibility has to do with, it strikes us intuitively as reasonable or not.
Okay.
So
It's a more of a qualifier than a quantifier.
yeah, I guess you can say maybe philosophers will disagree with us using the word qualifier, quantifier. But to get the point of that's basically it. When we say something is more probable, it's going to get quite nuanced. But probability has to do with background information.
Right.
When I say is that probable? Well, probable based on what? Based on the background information that I have. That's how you calculate.
Make it abstract. Maybe are there any examples that you can think?
Example would be: is it probable that I could die of lung cancer?
If I smoke.
So that is the background information.
Okay.
Okay. So when you calculate the probability, it is calculated based on the background information that you have.
Okay.
So when you ask the question, when you see that I have been smoking, so that adds to the data set that we have. Right. So now it becomes much more probable. Right. But if you're keeping the whole question of whether I smoked or not completely out of it, you may say, oh, it's completely improbable. But you haven't taken out of the background information. Now the plausible part would have to do, it may not be quantifiable in that sense. And the other distinction also with the plausibility is that it can strike different people differently. Like now the next episode we're going to look at the nothing part. Like, can something come from nothing?
Right.
Okay. It strikes us so intuitively that things cannot come into being from nothing. But it has to do with plausibility, not probability. So which is why people will come up and say, I think it's highly plausible that something can come from nothing.
Right.
So that is the way you're taking a detour onto this. But yeah, so Dr. K comes with that presentation. And what's unique about the Kalam, and I think we have reached the end of the episode. What's unique about the Kalam is that in 2007, the Cambridge Companion to Atheism came out, and I forgot the name of the person who wrote in it. He pointed out that, he recently passed away as well. He pointed out that the Kalam Cosmological Argument that Dr. Craig presented, it has garnered more philosophical response in journals than any other argument for God's existence. So even now, I think most recently Alex Malpass came out with advanced rebuttal of sort against the Kalam. Recently there was a massive video that came out that featured some of the biggest scientists and philosophers trying to rebut to the Kalam. Why is this one particular argument, decades later, is still garnering so much attention? Because it's so intuitively simple, but the ramification that the argument brings forth and the power that it brings forth is that something that you're reckoned with. And the philosophical scientific world has taken account of it. So which is why
It
Kalam
reminds
is...
me of Dr. Strange saying, it's a simple spell, but quite unbreakable.
So,
Right.
so that is the reason why Kalam is very effective. It's simple. It brings scientific arguments, it brings philosophical arguments. It makes sense of real life data. It's something that we ourselves can make sense of, and it has stood definitely the test of time. So in the next episode, I'm sure that we will be diving properly into the Kalam.
Yeah, and stay tuned for that. All right. Thank you so much, you guys, for connecting with us today and being part of this episode. Be sure to follow us on our social handles, Saft Apologetics everywhere on Instagram, on YouTube, on Twitter.
Facebook.
And Facebook, right? And just make sure to follow us over there for more updates. And thank you so much for being with us on this episode of SAF Podcast.